Welcome to the Staying Active podcast.
All right, welcome back to another episode of Staying Active. Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about injury prevention, and evidently, I'm on the hot seat for this one. What's going on, John?
That's right. We're going to flip the structure on its head. I'm going to ask you some hard-hitting questions. For you, these are probably softballs because you are, and this, I mean this as a compliment, but you are a training nerd, and that's why we love you. So this is going to be awesome. I think people are going to get a lot of good information about that. So are you ready?
I hope so, but let's go for it and see how I do.
Awesome. So to dive right in, I feel like we've done a pretty good job thus far of convincing our listeners that exercise is good, they should be doing it, and it should include some form of resistance training or strength training. I think those are like you probably agree with me there.
I think so. I could say that we've hit those points in just about every episode.
And so, with that in mind, one of the questions that I get commonly in a clinical scenario is that okay, people are convinced that they need to start doing this, but they're not necessarily sure where to start. And they're very worried, especially people the longer they live, they're very worried about injury. They're very worried about getting hurt. They're very worried about kind of injury sidelining them from either continuing physical activity or hobbies that they like, or just, running around after their family or things like that.
Sure.
So I figured it'd be a good idea to talk about all things kind of injury prevention, especially when people are starting out on a training regimen, but going kind of along the spectrum of, people from when they're initially starting to elite athletes. So I guess to kind of give you an initial kind of open-ended question is, how do you, someone who's kind of started training before they even lift a weight or pick up a weight, what are some of the general principles you're telling them as to, don't do this, don't do that, but like how do we avoid generally injury, and what's the kind of like the speech that you're giving people before you start training them?
Yeah, this is like heavily nuanced, right? And I'm sure there's a ton of opinion backed into this. Mainly because, all right, the concept of injury prevention is really interesting to me overall, because marketing injury prevention is, I don't want to call it snake oil, but it's really hard to prove. One of the interesting studies that I've read about like physical therapy specifically is like, we know enough about physical therapy specifically, like the concept of it. You get injured, you have to go and have somebody help you become uninjured or at least functional again. And I'm gonna really mess up some of the definitions here, so hang with me. But we don't actually know for sure that what you're doing is what's making you better, because you could theoretically do nothing in some instances, and time could also heal several things. And so there's this like kind of, up in the air, like what works. And I'm not saying that to attack physical therapy in any way. I'm a huge believer, and I you know, if someone tells you, if your physician tells you need to go do physical therapy and you don't, and you stay injured, let's put two and two together here. You should go accept the help. But when it comes to injury prevention, it gets even more ridiculous, because now we're talking about theoretically being injured from something that we have not yet identified. And so I am really like very careful with this, because yes, you come to me, you're a prospective client or a patient or something along those lines, and you're like, I don't want to get hurt. And I'm like, well, I hope not. Let's just start with like that as a baseline. I would hope that you don't want to get hurt, and I would hope you would assume that me, my team, we don't want you to get hurt. That doesn't help anyone. Now, when it comes to like, what do I do at baseline? Just having more skeletal muscle mass is better for like injury prevention. You can say just generally, like if you were to fall, if you had like say let's reference that sarcopenia episode. If we were to talk about, you kick the can down the road and you've lost 50% of your skeletal muscle mass, well, now we know for a fact that you have reduced your baseline functionality, right? Things like getting up out of a chair, putting things on a shelf, walking, like you drag your feet. These are things that you are going to limit. And then if you look at it from the injury perspective, your like the dangers of falling increase exponentially. Things like femur breaks, hip fractures, things that shouldn't happen to a healthy person become legitimate risks. And that is as a result of like far too little muscle mass, skeletal muscle mass. So from like that very specific context, having like reduced your risk for falls, reduced your risk from like functional baseline activity deviation. These are all important things. More specifically, where do we start? We start with, have you been injured before? Do you have pain points that currently exist? Do you currently have arthritis? Do you have tendinitis? Have you herniated a disc before? We start there. Understanding where you have been is a huge factor in deciding where you should go and how you should get there. And then the next aspect is, does your body currently move in a way, right? You could call that a compensation or a movement deviation. I don't want to get too crazy with the terms, but does your body currently move in a way that is disadvantageous to what you are trying to do? If it does not move well for the thing you're trying to do, then we should try to put you in a position where it moves better for that activity. And that, in my opinion, is probably the best way to reduce your risk of injury. Understand where you've been and understand what you want to do. And then you evaluate from that platform.
Gotcha. Understood. From the standpoint of someone who is just starting out, you say they've gone through their first workout with a trainer, or even someone who's like starting up again, or someone who's even a trained athlete.
Sure.
How do you coach people through what is soreness and what is injury? And where does that line kind of cross? How do you know when to stop, and how do you know if something's a true injury?
Yeah, that's really excellent question. So there's a couple different parts to this. So like it's called DOMS, delayed onset muscle soreness, right? Typically lasts right around 72 hours, and it can take up to 24 hours, to kind of settle in. It's different for everybody, but I would start by saying the things specifically that causes soreness is important to note here. And it's novelty. So a person whom has not been working out at all, a person whom has taken some time off, or a person whom has been exercising in a very specific way and is now exercising in a very different way, are very likely to experience some soreness, because that novelty, that difference in movement and stress is ultimately what causes the pain, the soreness, if you will. Now, like I said, it can last like up to 3 days, right? And so we have to decide what is pain, right? And I hate using pain scales for people because, John, I have no idea what you feel. I don't know what you've been through. Pain is
pain scales universally stink.
Very subjective, right? And so I don't like to use them. I simply will like say, look, I empathize, there is some degree of discomfort, but can you do the things that you need to do? If you're like, oh my God, getting off the toilet is just so hard. I'm like, but you can do it, right? Like, it's not pleasant, right? But you can do it. All right, then you're probably not injured. Is the area, very hot? Is the area very unstable? Is the area inflamed or taking on fluid? Those are kind of all hallmarks for injury. Is there pain shooting downward? Right. That's typically indicative of nerve pain, which, typically involves an impingement or a compression or a herniation. Those are all telltale signs. It typically doesn't go up. It almost always goes down. These are like good kind of loose indicators of injury versus just baseline discomfort. If it's radiating and it's just like my biceps hurt, my arms are hurting, and it's kind of staying in your biceps, it's probably just soreness. If you can continue to do things, but with like a little bit of rigidity and a little bit of like aching, then yeah, it's certainly some soreness. Um, Now, that being the case, I do like heavily discuss the like what is novelty? What does that mean? It's not simply the diversity of movement, something as simple as volume, how many reps and sets you're doing. That can be novel to a person. If all you've ever done is walk, 2 miles a day, well, then I bet you anything, if we do some body weight squats for sets of 10 or 12 to like full depth and we do them properly, I don't know, there's a chance you're going to be sore from that. And so I put that on the person and on the trainer if they're working with somebody, right? To monitor that. First things first, just make good choices, right? If you're like, man, I am worked after 2 sets, well, then maybe that's enough for today. I'm a big proponent of the phrase consistency over intensity. Um, and I tell a lot of my team this to this day. You will likely not help someone today. You will work on helping them. You will start, kind of chipping away at that goal, but you will likely not help them in its totality. You're not going to get them to their goal today, but you could hurt them today. You can easily do that. And so I'm a live to fight another day kind of guy when it comes to that, because it's all just data that we're collecting. You can always come back tomorrow as long as you're able. You can always come back next week as long as you're able. And so that the idea of just that progressive overloading is really, really important. And so I know that's a long-winded response, but soreness is incredibly difficult to put a scale on. And so it comes down to what can you do, what do you want to do, and how uncomfortable are you while you do it. All things are going to come with some degree of risk, right? And when I say risk, I mean like, yeah, you're going to be sore. How sore are you willing to be?
Right. No, that's
And then
that's
go
a
from there.
that's a great point. And as a piece of anecdote there, and this is a recommendation to people not to do this, but if anyone is familiar with the Murph workout, it's a workout that Navy SEALs do on Memorial Day. It's a mile with a weighted vest, and then it's I think 100 pull-ups, 200 push-ups, and 300 squats, and then another mile with a weighted vest as fast as you can.
Yeah.
Speaking of novelty, I did it for the first time, untrained, well, at my baseline level of training 2 years ago, and then I couldn't move for a week after.
Yeah.
So in terms of like living to fight another day, very bad. Don't do that. Very sore, bordering injury, right?
Yeah.
But that's the
mean,
whole point of what you're talking about, right? Is
that's
not
it.
we're not looking for weekend warriors here. We're looking for people who are doing consistent things. And to the point of you mentioned volume.
Yeah.
And like even changing up the sets and reps can be something that is novel for people, and that can produce muscle soreness. As a general principle, do you have any preference of people who do low weight high rep versus high weight low rep versus like 1 rep max? Because there's a spectrum along, and people have very strong opinions in all camps. So what are your thoughts on how you think about the high weight, low rate, high rep, and is that even the right way to be thinking about this?
So I mean, this has become a point of contention in like the exercise phys world recently, because the better the technology gets and the smarter people get and the more interested those smart people become in exercise science, the more studies come out and the more testing happens. And so I think I'll start with kind of broad overview. There's a lot of really interesting studies right now that have talked about total volume, uh, of like effective sets per muscle group. And the most recent one that I looked into, and I believe it was actually Mike Israetel, I believe, had this guy on his podcast, but he did a study. I think the guy was out of Stanford. They did a study of like up to 52 sets per muscle per week, which is an
That's
insane.
that's diabolical.
It's
Yeah.
insane. I don't know how a person would have the time to get that done, because you couldn't do it in a day. You would have to do it over the course of multiple days, and then you start looking at multiple body parts. The math is insane, but they were able to see increases in muscle mass, with increases in volume. Now that's not to say that the juice was worth the squeeze, per se, right? You don't know what percent, of increase there was as of right now. I can't say off the top of my head. So I won't sit here and be like, yeah, you should do as much as possible. But I will say that the science right now is kind of leaning in the direction of what you can recover from, you will improve from, right? And the recover from is kind of the important part of that. And so when it comes to specifically the design and programming. So sets, reps, volume, whether it's high, medium, low. I think that this comes down to like needs based things, right? If you are, over 50, even like over 40 maybe, and you just like clinically need more skeletal muscle mass, well, then greater volume, right? Getting higher to like closer to the, I would call it like 10 to 12 sets per muscle group per week range has proven to be very, very effective. Now, that being said, that's a lot of volume, and we're talking about effective volume. We're talking about like working sets is the terminology, which essentially means like strenuous, difficult sets. So it's not like you're gonna have a 300-pound bench press and you're gonna be like, cool, that's my baseline strength. I'm gonna do like chest presses for 10 sets of 10 with set like 10-pound weights. That's probably not effective for that person's top end ability. And as a result, the minimum effective dose or that threshold for adaptation will not be met. So finding that like those 10 sets, whether you want to break it up over different movements, I definitely recommend, because of just changing joint angles and avoiding overload in like single planes of motion, I think are really helpful. But that 10 to 12 sets per week is highly effective for increasing skeletal muscle mass. So that's like a hypertrophy based range, right? And we haven't even talked about reps yet. Now, reps get a little bit more in the weeds, because regardless of what you may or may not know about like the current accepted science of like rep ranges and what they may or may not do, I'm going to take it back to just like what's obvious. Time is a factor for every single person, with the exception to like the ultra rich and like professional athletes who are like paid to be in a certain shape, right? So if you have time as a barrier, as most of us do, doing 3 sets of any or 3 reps of anything should probably be very heavy, because if you did 3 reps at like 60% of your top end, it probably won't stimulate you that much. Probably won't create or generate this adaptive response that we're talking about. So you're going to need to load it heavier, right? And if you load it heavier, it's obviously going to be harder. And then you're getting into what I would call like top end strength. Problem with that is you're going to also stimulate your nervous system, not necessarily just your muscles and joints. And so you're going to need a lot of time to recover to then be able to do it again. And so now we have choices to make. We can either underload and go for higher volume. We can go with a higher top end load and go for strength and power. Right? I'm not even going to touch on speed and all that because it'll get too complicated. But my recommendation for most people is to try to have like one movement per workout where it is kind of like a baseline, a push, a pull, a squat, a hinge, where you work the like higher end of your like absolute strength or your max strength, if you will. Don't worry about the terminology too much. Just think something very heavy under lower volume, because you want to stimulate your nervous system. You do want to be strong as possible, but that doesn't necessarily equate to having bigger muscles, right? Output and hypertrophy or like building muscle are different concepts. You can build muscle by doing strength work, but we know that you need between those 10 to 12 sets per week. And when you bring time into the situation, we know that when you load things heavier with lower volume, you need to rest a lot longer, making it infinitely more challenging to get these 10 to 12 sets in a reasonable amount of time. So I typically try to structure workouts for the average person where they pick one movement, or I pick one movement per workout where we try to hit some amount of like top end strength. And then I try to build in as much accessory or like muscle building movements and rep ranges and set ranges as possible, because there are things that we're competing with here. There's some science that we're competing with, and we want to get that volume, but we also want to be as strong as possible. So that's a lot of information, and I'm ranting. I apologize. But all of that being said, if you don't care about being as strong as possible, then more volume is your friend. If you don't care about having as much muscle as possible and you don't care about the time or whatever the case is, then higher loads and lower volume is great too. But I think a solid mix of those two things is appropriate for the average person.
Gotcha. And for if someone is starting out, and you mentioned some of these like 60% of like, maximum, or use some of these percentages of maximum. Are you recommending that people do a max lift to get that, or is it more off of a like RPE or like rate of perceived exertion, or is it like a guesstimate? Like, especially if we don't want people starting out just going as hard as they can right away, because that may, in my mind at least, increase the risk for injury. How are you coaching them as to what a good weight range would be like to achieve that like 60% or 80% or
Sure.
those?
So exercise science is funny because, well, we think we're funny. The answer to pretty much every question in exercise science is, well, that depends. And so I laughed to myself about my nerd humor. Okay, so definitions here are important, and I will do my best to not ruin them while also like providing some of my own opinion. You mentioned rate of perceived exertion, which is like commonly referred to as RPE, which essentially means like how did something feel? It's a scale that we often like mess around with because it's not actually a 1 to 10 scale. I'm pretty sure it's like a 5 to 14 scale, but we're going to ignore that and just say a 1 to 10 because it's easier. First things first, I don't recommend 1 rep maxes for the average person. If you're handling a weight that you could theoretically only do one time, the room for error is very small. And in an untrained person, that is an unnecessary amount of risk. I myself do not mess around with a lot of 1 rep maxes, except when I was competing in powerlifting. but even still, it has a high risk of injury, and so I don't recommend it. Back to the RPEs. RPE is basically like you're saying how many more do you think you could have done, that sort of thing. And that's where the definitions get a little mixed around. I prefer the term RIR, reps in reserve, and then to utilize that based on how much time you plan to give yourself for rest. So this is where some investigation is going to be necessary for each person, because you're going to choose a weight, you're going to choose a rep range, all right? And then you're going to say, okay, I'm going to do this 10 times. I'm going to do a chest press 10 times. And then afterwards, you're going to say, how many more do I think I could have done? Right? And so a good place to operate from is anywhere between like 6 to 8, right? If we were doing an RPE. So like if you have 10 more in the tank, if you've got 10 more in the reserve, it's too light. It's not going to generate an adaptive response unless you do many, many, many sets. So my recommendation is to choose a working weight that you can do anywhere between 2 and 4 more times. And that's typically a really effective, challenging range, especially if you're sticking with a rest period of no more than about 90 seconds. If you're going to go with rest periods that are closer to 2 minutes, 3 minutes, 4 minutes, my expectation that you should have closer to like 2 or 1 reps in the reserve, right? It should be much more difficult. And now we're approaching that like max strength sort of concept here. So again, thinking about how much time are you going to give yourself to rest? How many reps do you plan to do? And then how heavy is the weight in relation to how many more you could have performed? That's how you would ideally choose the appropriate working weight for an exercise. If you're going to just do 10 reps and you're like, oh man, it's really heavy because I'm only giving myself 10 seconds of rest. Well, now we're kind of getting into the realm of like, is this actually effective for like muscular development, or are we getting more into like oxidative fitness, more like cardiovascular fitness? That's what I would question. So there are nuances there with regard to how much rest is necessary in order for you to perform optimally to stimulate that adaptive response. And please, Jon, if I'm getting too off into the weeds on this, pull me back. I can try to simplify.
This is why we love you on this, is because this is more than just high low weight high rep is better than, like, no, you're actually kind of going into the nuance of this, which is I think what our listeners want, and that's what I want. So
well, we want to consider what these people need, and we want them to feel safe, and so we think about these things on a very deep level. And when we make choices, we're making them from a position of as much fact as possible, and we're trying to make these decisions with like, what have you told us that you want or what you need in mind? And we're not making it up. There's a way to do this in an efficient, effective way, and that's what we want for you.
Yeah.
So,
and it's interesting to me too, because as much as we keep learning more and more about the mechanisms of of injury and why that happens, of hypertrophy and muscle strength and why that happens, but at the end of the day, it's been well documented since like, the ancient Greeks and probably before that like, you lift heavy things, you'll get stronger, right? And so obviously there's a lot of nuance here, and that's what we're diving into, is we're using kind of a modern framework to help our patients, help our clients. And so to that point of within the framework of injury prevention, and mentioning that you had you typically like to have a push, a pull, a squat, a hinge, like these types of exercises. What are some of your favorite exercises when you're starting someone out on a workout routine to avoid injury? I mean, I imagine you're not having them start with a, overhead squat, right? Or like a snatch, right? Like what are some of your favorite exercises? And as part two to that question, um, your opinion on machines versus free weights from the standpoint of injury prevention, but also just, general kind of muscle building and strengthening.
That's an absolute bait question, and you know it. Don't let me forget about that part. I'll start by I'll start by addressing the favorite movements. So the way I learned to train was almost the exact opposite of like how you're supposed to train, because I came up in a like very clinical kind of like observational, like almost borderline medical like viewpoint for training. And so initially we focused a ton on how a person moves, and we focused a lot on muscles. Now, that is not what what you should focus on for the most people, because there's so much like in the weeds nonsense that you can do by focusing exclusively on muscles. I can look at any person and be like, well, this is slightly less efficient, and you could use more stability in the shoulder girdle, and and we can end up doing absolutely nothing as a result of it. And so I like to operate from the place of about what I call about 80% safe. All right. Can the person perform the movement, you know, with like an abundance of caution while still getting an opportunity to like do something, right? I don't want to have to step in and change everything they're doing, like every minute detail, because then they don't get any experience, and then they never improve. So that being the case, I'm kind of a basics guy, right? I at the at the end of the day, it's all just like knee bending and elbow bending, in different forms. And so the way I like to do it is like, let's get you doing something so that way we can progress from there and just go from there. So like I love to start with a box squat and let the person show me whether they can or cannot do it, because the risk for injury is very low. And if they can show that they can pull themselves into the box, and they can, allow their knees to move forward and their feet stay flat on the floor, right? Like that's great, because now I can give you a weight and we can still do the box squat with now some added load. And it just becomes really easily scalable. But a squat is a squat is a squat, regardless of how difficult or easy or simple, however you want to say it. It's still just knee flexion, right? Hip extension, right? So I love a box squat initially for evaluation purposes, but it also tells me like what type of squatting will they be able to do in the future, barring any previous injury or anything like that. I love a cable row for most people, like a seated cable row, for teaching people how to like pull with their elbows and use their lat muscles in their back. Also for understanding and teaching how the shoulder blades, how the scapula moves. It moves in kind of a few different weird ways, and most people have a hard time feeling things, quote unquote, that are behind them that they can't see. So I think that's a really safe, stable movement to start with, that you can also load pretty heavily and challenge the average person with, even an athlete with pretty well. I love a dumbbell chest press, unless someone has like extreme kyphosis, right? A lot of like upper back rounding where their shoulder girdle sits really far forward, right? With exception to people who have like those really serious postural deviations, I just love a basic chest press. Um, and then for the hamstrings and the glutes, I like to start with a hip bridge, like an isometric hip bridge initially, mainly because deadlifts are a difficult movement to teach a person initially. And if they don't have great, um, like physical feedback from themselves, if they don't have great like sensation from their hamstrings or their glutes, or they don't understand hip extension, it's just usually not worth trying to teach them initially because it can take a ton of time and the risk of injury is still there. Um, so I usually like an isometric bridge, like a single leg isometric bridge. So like holding the top of a bridge for like 30 seconds or so. I don't care who you are. You do that for 30 seconds to a minute, you're gonna start shaking.
Yeah.
Um, I'm like I said, it's not sexy at all, but I really like the basics. I think at the end of the day, we're very individualized in like what we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis with regard to like previous injury, pain points, what I care about, what I want to learn about, what I don't want to do. It's highly variable. And so I'm just trying to collect information. The more
Mm,
data that I can collect, the better. And I recommend the same for like if you're training yourself, right?
mm,
You don't have to do the craziest, most diverse movements, right? I think making the choice of like being bored in the gym is not ideal, right? But you also shouldn't like you shouldn't maximize for entertainment.
mm.
You should maximize for efficiency and effectiveness and try to make it fun along the way. But in that order for sure. So
Yeah.
keep it simple, learn as much as you can, and then add from there. If you're getting bored of the movement, I promise there's a million different versions of the exact same thing that are probably as effective.
Yeah. And then to the part two of the machines versus free weights, because you walk into a name your commercial gym,
Yeah.
and you walk in there and there's maybe a few benches, maybe a few squat racks, and then there's a plethora of machines which all do seemingly one thing. Um, and those seem to be kind of the popular things.
hmm
So what are your thoughts on machines uh versus free weights?
Um, I definitely bias towards free weights, and learning to move your own body in space and move weights around you, right? There's a ton of support here for just like joint stability, right? I'm like very big on functional utility. I'm saying a lot, I apologize. I want to get the most from the equipment that we're utilizing, and I want the most benefit from the time spent. And so free weights have a natural effectiveness in that regard because you have to stabilize them yourself. They aren't going to move through the range of motion in any sort of guided way. And so there is a element of learning curve and kind of figuring out what the best position is for your limb length and abilities are, but that's part of it. I would say then next after that is like cables and bands, right? They are semi-fixed, semi-stable. They can obviously be placed in like any different position so you can maximize their efficiency. And then after that, I would say machines. When you're building a workout, I would say try to start with the most challenging things first. And so if it's holding something that is unstable and heavy, I would call that much more difficult than using a machine that stabilizes the load and the range of motion for you. That being said, machines are quite difficult to injure yourself on, which really just kind of moves into my point about back ending the workout with them. I'm a big fan of doing the biggest, most difficult thing first and kind of reducing the difficulty, quote unquote, as you become more tired. And so, towards the end of your workout, if you've done a bunch of bench press and dumbbell rows and overhead presses and all these like big, crazy things, and you want to finish with some like cable rows or some machine pull downs or whatever, Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, you're still working the muscle, you're still trying to build skeletal muscle, and you're just going to do it in a safer way than if you were to go also try to rip off a bunch of pull-ups, right?
Right. Yeah.
So it's a risk reward thing. I don't love using machines exclusively, mainly due to the lack of stability needs. I don't think you actually learn to use your own body. And I do think that there is something to be said about it's like you have holes in your game, if you will. If you start to build your muscles and you get very strong in these very fixed ranges and planes of motion, but you don't have the stability to manage that strength. The term I would use and that I always used to hear when I was coming up is it's like firing a cannon from a canoe. You've got all this power, but you've got no stability to support it. So you're likely going to do more damage to yourself than you are to any target you have.
I like that. I like that analogy. Firing a kid, because you can imagine, right? That's. I like that.
You got this big old powerful weaponry, but you can't hold it, so it is pretty useless to you.
Yeah,
And
just
in
shoots
fact, it's
you across the pond, right? Yeah.
probably quite dangerous. Yeah.
So in the last little bit that we have here, I
Mhm.
wanted to talk a little bit more about the recovery, because you mentioned
Mm.
that a lot of injury prevention involves what you can recover from safely,
Yeah.
and a lot of kind of what we create for clients in terms of their workouts and what we recommend for people is doing things that they can recover from, and therefore increasing sustainability.
Yep.
So um, you may have I know you have read the David Goggins book, Can't Hurt Me.
Of course.
And so in that book, for those of you who haven't read it, not to spoil it necessarily, but he's achieves all this greatness, essentially gets to a point where he can't move, he can't function, he's just like in bed all day, and then he discovers stretching. And he's
Yeah.
like, oh, if I stretch, I can actually do a lot more. I can be more functional. I can get my life back. Um, and that's one of the things that one of several things that contributed to me, and also just kind of waking up somewhat stiff, starting a little bit more of a stretching routine just to generally feel better. But from the standpoint of injury prevention and recovery, what is your opinion on stretching? I mean, that's kind of like, by that I mean static stretching, like, you're touching your toes, you're putting your arm across your body, you're those types of things, versus maybe more dynamic stretching, maybe versus something more functional oriented like yoga or Pilates, or what are your thoughts on some of these things for recovery and injury prevention?
Sure. Um, I think the concept of recovery has unfortunately become its own market, which has led to a tremendous amount of like bad information kind of flooding in and in the form of marketing mostly. And what I mean by that is we've taken something that is fairly simple, rest, right? We've taken something that's fairly simple and we've made it extraordinarily complicated. You need a device for everything, you need to measure everything, you have routines for everything. And I think that stems from honestly just a cash grab. And so that being the case, I have a lot of opinions in that arena. Um, I, if I were to simplify it, is like being an extremist, being polarizing for most things is typically bad. You should typically settle into like, well, what's like reasonable? I could sit here and, prescribe a routine for somebody that would probably take 24 hours and it would be all substantiated by the latest science if you let me choose the articles, right? Uh, and so that's obviously unsustainable and ridiculous, right? And so we're gaming for what we can do consistently. If anybody takes anything away from this podcast in particular, I want it to be consistency over intensity. Be able to do these things reliably and sustainably and come back and do it again tomorrow. And so when it comes to stretching, I would say I don't have a ton of opinion on like what you do, how you do it. There's a argument for everyone for everything. If you lack the range of motion that you need for a specific activity, it is very likely that you lack either flexibility or mobility. It depends on whether or not the range that you need is passive or active. All right. If you can't bend over and touch your toes, you probably need more flexibility, right? If you can't pull yourself into the bottom of a squat, you probably need more mobility, right? It depends on what you want to do. I don't particularly care about touching my toes other than the fact that everybody's like, look what I can do. It doesn't serve a tremendous benefit to me otherwise. And so I won't judge a person's abilities on whether or not they can do that. It comes back to what do you need to do and how do you feel? I know many people will say that they benefit, in terms of recovery from a stretching routine, especially if they are punishing their body with like constant abuse. Shout out to David Goggins. He's an incredible human being. He's very inspiring. I love his book. He's definitely a psycho. And I mean that in the most loving possible way. The things that he can do are not associated to his physical abilities, they are associated to his mental, emotional abilities. And discovering stretching, he was running hundreds of miles per week. Like these are like crazy numbers, to the point where he has no cartilage left in his knees, his feet are destroyed. You know, he is clearly a benefactor. Like he will benefit from stretching because he's constantly abusing himself. But I'm not going to sit here and be like, yeah, stretching is the miracle thing. It is going to fix you and everything. Because I just don't believe that's true. I think it's far more simple than that. I think that if you do nothing other than monitor your overall load and volume, how stressed out you're making your body during workouts, you will likely not have to do anything other than drink water, eat enough like calories and protein specifically, um, and sleep enough. Most other things would fall into your arena. Maybe it's hormonal, maybe it's biochemical, maybe it is genetic, right? But these are very specific, what I would call like more likely outlier conditions that you would look into with the assistance of a physician. If you need much more than like, hey, I'm not drinking enough water and like correlated to that, I'm not recovering all that well, I'm going to be like, yeah, probably. Like you're right. We should address that first. That's not to say that stretching is bad, or that, one, dynamic versus static is better or worse. I think everything has a place in any given program. If you feel good doing a thing and you perform well when you do those things, it is likely fine. It is maybe even a good idea. Um, who knows? There's a lot of variety there. But I will say that as far as like static versus dynamic stretching, in a warm up, for example, dynamic stretching is easily the winner there. There's no use in lengthening your muscles and then going and trying to contract them, from a cold to warm standpoint. It's just like, okay, if anything, maybe this might make things a bit more injury prone, but I don't know if I've seen enough evidence to be like, yeah, that's for sure true. But like you want to prepare for the workout, and so it's just like a suboptimally loaded version of what you're about to do. So it's like you're gonna get your heart rate up, you're gonna move in the way that you're about to perform. You're going to train your nervous system and you're going to get your nervous system prepared to do those things. So that way it's not like out of nowhere. Um, and static stretching leans more in the movement direction. And so that's why I would prioritize it over static stretching.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I hate to be like, meh, about this, but it's like an area where I'm probably the least concerned, because the things
Gotcha.
that we know work really well are within reach for most people. And if they just try to optimize for hydration, sleep,
Mm,
and what I would just call like loading,
yeah.
um, then you're going to be fine, right? I said earlier, I don't know if I used this phrase specifically, but when we're talking about an adaptive response, it's the minimum effective dose for whatever your goal is. No
Right.
more. Once
Right.
you attain that adaptive response for your goal specifically, why would you continue to just grind yourself into the dirt? Go start recovering and be able
Right.
to do it again tomorrow.
Right. And then in the last, that's fantastic, and I think Met is a fair answer there, obviously. Don't feel bad about that. But the last question for you in the few minutes that we have left is getting back to the recovery piece and the consistency piece.
Sure.
How often are we supposed to be doing something every day? And how much time between working certain muscle groups are we supposed to take from an injury prevention standpoint? Are we supposed to let our muscles recover fully and wait at least 72 hours to get that delayed onset muscle soreness completely out of the system? Are we trying to hit the same muscle group right away the next day? Are we doing 2 days? Uh, what is your typical recommendation for amount of time, or I guess number of days spent training similar areas per week?
So it's going to depend on the person, obviously. There I go again. It depends. Um, it's going to depend on the person in a lot of ways. I I would be hard pressed to recommend like two hard strength training sessions a day for any person. If you were saying like one's a conditioning session, one's a strength training session, I could probably get behind it for some populations of people. I can get behind it for some populations of people. Let me rephrase. Um, this is gonna be kind of a broken record answer, but what you can recover from is what is effective. So if you're like, I'm wrecked after a workout and I need 3 days, then you have your answer, right? What you can recover from and what is sustainable. And recovery for you is, can you do the same thing again if you had to, right? There's a ton of nuance with like the way that your nervous system responds to stress and how it recovers. Like you can get into like powerlifting ideology and like peaking for competition and nervous system. We're not going to go there because it's kind of just like it doesn't matter for the average person, but just keeping it in this wheelhouse, I would just say, what can you get to the gym 2 days a week? Okay, cool. Are those days Monday and Tuesday? Okay, well, don't worry about that, because yes, it might be challenging initially, but your body is an adaptive organism. It actually likes stress in a matter of speaking. When you apply a stress to it, it typically responds, as long as the stress does not like overcome you, right? So as long as you're not like you're in the gym for 5 hours and you're just destroying yourself, then yeah, it's gonna be fine. Maybe the first couple weeks are unpleasant, as far as like, oh man, I'm more sore than I want to be. I'm a little more tired, but you will adapt. And I tell people, what you can commit to will be fine. If that's what you can do, then that is fine. If you're like, I can work out 5 days a week and I'm doing great, well, then I would say, yeah, you're probably undulating your effort with your natural energy levels and your natural recovery cycle. But who cares? Who are you competing with, right? If you are feeling good, if you are getting better, then what you are doing is effective. And so I don't have these like deep opinions about like what is going to be the best, because it, at the end of the day, like optimizing is a weird word, like trying to optimize for results or effectiveness, because it's not that simple. I think we get into the weeds too much in like with social media and influencers, where we're like, you have to do this thing, you have to optimize for this thing, but then you just end up with a bunch of people who will fail no matter what, because they just can't. If you have kids, guess what? There was no snow today and we had a 2-hour delay. And so things were uncomfortable for me. Right. And so I didn't have an optimal day, but I did something. Right. And that's just the way it works sometimes. So I just don't want to get into like, I don't know. I think that's unhealthy. So I will say what you can recover from is ultimately what is effective. If you like to train 5 days a week and you feel good, awesome. You're probably doing it right. Don't do 2-a-days unless you are like on a football team and like that's what they're doing. I promise you, if you're doing 2 days, they're probably going to do strength training in one session and then conditioning in another session, because doing strength training twice doesn't make any sense. We just talked about the recovery cycle, and like you want to start that as soon as possible, right? But I personally, to give like a more concrete example, I like to train 4 days a week. I do upper body, lower body, upper body, lower body, and then I do 4 days of jujitsu. 3 days are technique, so they're very slow, they're very easy, they're not stressing me out. And then I do 1 day of like live conditioning, like live rolling. That works for me as long as I sleep enough, as long as I eat enough, as long as I don't push myself too hard in any of those multiple sessions. That's just me. I don't feel awesome all of the time, but I'm not optimizing for how I feel when I do jujitsu. I'm optimizing for I like doing this.
Right.
So is it optimal? Probably not, but I like it, and so I'm not going to stop.
I love that. I love that. And I think the fair answer of it depends to a lot of this.
Yeah.
I hear that a lot also from my patients who are lawyers, is like the answer is always it depends. And so in that vein, no further questions, Your Honor. I think you did a
Yeah.
great job. Knocked this out
Yeah.
of the park. So thanks for letting us flip this one on its head.
Yeah, and you know what? It makes me think for the future, just because it might be infuriating to some, but I don't know if I'm optimizing for that. So we could pick some more specific examples or case studies, and we can talk about what should this person do, and kind of get into more concrete advice, or even just like frameworks, rather than kind of being ambiguous and open-ended.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I encourage people, if you have commentary or you would like us to use you as an example, please speak now.
Awesome.
But
Derek, why don't you take us home then, and then we'll catch people in the next episode.
absolutely. All right. So just because it's coming up, we have the grand opening of our newest facility in Farmington, Connecticut, opening up on April 1st. And we have an open house on April 8th, a grand open house from 3 to 5 p.m. That is the man, the myth, the legend. That is going to be Dr. Jon Lis as your physician in that facility. And I couldn't be more excited. This is an open invitation. Please, if you'd like to come through, please do. We'd love to meet you, and we'd love to show off the new facility. It's going to be amazing. Other than that, we've got a bunch of cool stuff coming up. We'll be sure to start dropping some links to those things as they come up. Different things like different physician talks, different opportunities to come to the facilities, things like that. But otherwise, I've been Derek Marsette. This is Dr. Jon Lis, and this is Staying Active. Thanks, everybody.